Welcome everyone. So my name is Rik and Aart. I'm a manager at MJ Hudson, and we advise investors and companies to become more sustainable. And I will be your host for today's session. Aart and Rik are going to talk to us about the great work that they do at the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. And in our current pandemic-focused position, I believe it's great to hear a more optimistic, solution-oriented point of view for today. So first, Aart and Rik are going to provide us with some insights through a presentation. And after that, we will open up for a Q&A session. So I would like to invite you to send your questions already in the chat box if you have those already in mind. And I will do my best to get Rik or Aart to answer our questions in this session. So Rik, Aart, please feel free to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. It's really fantastic that Rik and I can join this Impact for Home session. My name is Aart Mulder. I'm already working for more than 16 years at the development bank FMO, a Dutch development bank. And I'm really looking forward to this session. And maybe, hopefully, if we all join efforts and have a good discussion afterwards, also we have an answer on the main question of this time, maybe. Is there really a solution for the climate crisis we are in currently? And this is a crisis that's going beyond COVID, of course, and all the misery currently. And we really think that there is an answer on that. There is a solution on it, as long as you also have a plan B. And that's what we like to highlight today. And hopefully, during the presentation of Rik and me, we can shed some light on the solution we have. And that's done actually by the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. And in the meantime, please interrupt me or send chats on the box. And if there's any question in between, then of course, more than welcome to answer them already during this presentation. Let's start first, Dutch Fund for Climate Development, what it actually entails. This is an initiative from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. And it's a fund of 160 million euros. The word Dutch stands for the fact that the finance comes from the Dutch ministry. But it doesn't mean that we need to work with Dutch companies, not at all actually. We have a mandate for developing countries, and of course if there is a Dutch angle, it might be welcome, but this doesn't play any role. What it does try to achieve is really doing something impactful on the climate space. And I want to highlight three key elements from this fund, and then we regularly will evolve further on the details. First of all, this fund is managed by FMO, that's the Dutch development bank where Rik and I are working for, but we do that together with a consortium, with WWF, well known of course, but also a large development organization, SNV, and a very commercial fund manager, climate fund managers. And what this combination of party actually achieves is that we try to initiate and develop projects within the climate space in developing countries. And in order to develop them, we need a lot of grant funding. So actually, two partners, SNV and WWF, are dedicated to the early stage projects. They help a climate project with the development by looking at the social aspect for communities, but also looking at the environmental aspects, and have grant funding available to help such a kind of initiative further develop towards a really scalable solution that can be financed. So that's the first thing to realize, very particular for this fund. It's a consortium with partners who try to develop projects in the early stage. Secondly, I think, and also is good to realize, is that after the development, we provide a long-term finance solution. So really the big bucket of money is provided, and it can be via debt or equity or any kind of other product. And the last item I like to highlight is that this fund is linked towards climate solutions, both on the adaptation and the mitigation space. And the mitigation space is maybe considered as the most cool in the world because it's about avoiding all kinds of green gases or sequestration of green gases. But maybe we think that even cooler might also be to have this plan B, to have this adaptation project realized. And maybe we can move to the next slide, and then we show also what we mean with adaptation. And this is actually a definition that's used by the IPCC. But To make it more simply, adaptation is just accepting the fact that to a certain extent the temperature will further rise, and what can we do actually to provide the solutions for resilience, meaning that how can we adapt to the fact that the climate is already changing currently. So this is actually the plan B story. The plan A needs to avoid greenhouse gases, but the plan B is also that you need to accept a certain rise of temperature. And what can we do to protect not only the environment, so the world, all living beings, but also the poorest human beings in the world. And that's actually the crux of adaptation. And to make it a little bit more concrete, if we look at what happened early this year, we had this climate adaptation summit where all the world leaders told their story, and it was really magnificent to see. It was headed here by Prime Minister Rutte in the Netherlands. But what all these world leaders actually said in general is that we do need to invest in climate, but also we do need to invest more in climate adaptation. So the plan B needs to be more prominently on the agenda, without neglecting, of course, plan A, which is trying to mitigate the risk of further rise of temperature. And it's quite simple from a business perspective. If you look at the slide that's shown here, there are all kinds of calculations that you need 1.8 trillion dollars or euros ultimately as by the end of 2030. And this means that per year, roughly, you need 180 billion. Currently, there's only 34 billion invested in these development countries for adaptation. So there's a gap, and the gap is quite clearly visible. If you look at the next bottom, maybe you can push it and you see what's happened actually. We need to bridge the gap between 100 and 180 billion on an annual basis and the 34 billion. But if we do that, actually, then we will have 1.8 trillion. Yeah, sorry for all these amounts, but I try to explain what's happening in the world. Then we have 1.8 trillion cumulatively invested in 2030, meaning that we will have only purely from an economic perspective, 7.1 trillion benefits against it. So if you forget all about humanity, all about protecting the environment, if you are just a hard accountant who looks at figures, then only for that reason already, we need to invest in climate adaptation because the benefits are much more obvious. And the 34 billion that has been invested until now on an annual basis roughly is divided roughly among agriculture, forestry, so that's really land-based, but also in water, including wastewater management, oceans, the broad area of everything that's related to water, and disaster risk management. And the disaster risk management, I think, is mostly due to a government issue regarding increasing dikes or any other kind of infrastructure works that needs to be done, but can also sometimes be privately. You can think about crop insurance to protect the crop against all kind of disasters, weather disasters, or early warning systems for poor people to roll out, or communities in general. But I think the agriculture and the water part, so the right part of this slide, are the most obvious for private investments. And to be clear on that, this fund is really targeting a private element in investments. We do not do solely governmental projects because we think you need the private sector to really scale up. And scale up is the key issue to battle climate change, that's for sure. And that's also reflected a bit in this slide. I don't want to walk through it in detail, but two key elements I think I would like to mention is that we need projects for a certain size. So the ticket size, the lowest line on the slide shows that it needs to be at least between 1 and 10 million on the project level we achieve. And secondly, I think I would like to highlight that the instruments we provide is extremely broad, as long as it attributes to a scalable solution with a certain private element. So it can be, again, debt, it can be grants, it can be equity, so shareholding, capital, or any kind of fancy products in between. And maybe we can move to the next slide to show what kind of sectors we talk about. Then I showed you the investments until now in these three areas, but we make it more specifically for this Dutch Fund for Climate Development. And we look just simply at the land side and at the water side. On the land side, we have the three elements: forestry, food, and land and ecosystems. Now, forestry and fruit can also be a combination of the two, like agroforestry. Land and ecosystems, we try to find a kind of scalable solution, and scalable means that there is a kind of certain business model also for very vulnerable areas, for peatlands, for instance, for protection of mangroves, for looking at kind of carbon credit solutions there, or any kind of non-forest products. And actually, we have quite a number of projects that it seems to work out. It doesn't seem to work out, it really works out until now. And the right side is the water side, and that's also, for instance, oceans, marine protection areas. We have now already one project on a really interesting marine protection area. We have projects around sanitation and projects around water. There's a lot of water scarcity because of climate change, because of droughts, and we try to find a solution there as well. Maybe we can then further go on what kind of problem do we really solve here? Because we talked about we need a lot of money, and we also said the business case is there for a lot of money. So simply, why doesn't it happen? What is the extremely strange situation why nothing happens, at least not enough, what we all know. And that has to be done with this value of death, we call it. And this is the dark side scenario, but Rik, my colleague, will share down the positive scenario, what kind of solution we have. But the reason why so many projects get stuck is the following. If you look at this graph, you see that a lot of grants in the early stage can be provided, and that costs a lot of time and a lot of money, in particular by a lot of institutions, by donors, by NGOs, sometimes by banks. And then suddenly you need to increase the number of grants, meaning that you go the lower down the graph, it costs even more money, and you get an extremely steep curve downside towards almost extremely negative financial figures. Well, the reason being, we think, and it's quite obvious in the project finance world, is that these grants are provided, but these parties do not have the institution behind them to make it directly in a kind of scalable model. So meaning they do, with the good intention, provide grants, but there's not a scalable finance solution on that. You miss actually the link towards a development bank like FMO or private investors going forward. So you need to integrate actually both the grant sector with the NGOs, with the financial sector. And that's what we try to achieve with DFCD by having this consortium of partners of WWF and SNV, and us as a bank, and client manager also as an investor. And Rik, you are there to provide a solution and give more details on how we do that.
Yeah, so indeed, the idea to make the value of death a value of opportunity is that we first start with the DFC origination facility managed by SNV and WWF that can provide really grants to really help and technical assistance to further develop these projects so that they really become commercially, or there's a commercial business plan there. And then followed on by that, there is an opportunity for the DFC land use facility and water facility to invest in these projects. And the idea is that over time, after these concepts have been proven, the projects have been de-risked, they can be taken over by other pools of capital that have a more commercial risk return target, such as DFI, which is FMO, itself with its own balance sheet, but also private investors eventually, if things really work out, such as pension funds. And I think what makes the DFCD really unique is that it is really an integrated consortium structure that we work with. So FMO is the lead partner, but is primarily focused on managing the land use facility, 55 million, investing in agricultural and forestry projects, as mentioned. You have climate fund managers, which is a relatively new fund manager that uses the 75 million that it gets through the DFCD to raise a larger private equity fund with quite a unique structure called Climate Investor 2, which can also use that money to raise external private capital. And then you have the origination facility, and together, we as a consortium really collaborate together very, very thoroughly just to select the right projects and scale these. What makes the DFCD then also particularly unique is that we really try to fund projects and help originate projects that align with the so-called landscape approach. So if you look at a project individually, it can have, you can look at climate risk and how those can be reduced. But ultimately, climate risk is very contextual. So we believe it's way better to look at the wider landscape so that together projects can have synergies and can together improve resilience even more. And so WWF is really an expert in this, and the idea is really to also bring together local stakeholders to really understand what are your needs. And as an example, we can take the Kafu flats in Zambia. And these are just some example projects, but we're already discussing quite some actual projects in the IC, where you look at the water tables in the region, and you make an analysis of what kind of farming practices are sustainable and which ones are not, and how can you promote this as a region so that the Zambian of the Kafu Flats ecosystems can be more sustainably managed, benefiting both just local communities, but also the ecosystems that these communities depend on.
Rik, could I maybe ask you a question that was sent by Camilla in the chat box?
Sure, yeah, please.
Great. So she asked whether you experience any challenges due to the working with a consortium.
Yeah, I mean, I think a nice saying is like, together you go slower, but you go further. We are widely different organizations, but I think we all have a common goal in mind, and that's why I think it works really, really well. But it is challenging to sometimes really bring together so many experts that have their own views and such a different organizational structure to do this. So there are some challenges. I do need to say there are also immense opportunities. So FMO, for example, doesn't have that much local staff in these countries, and SNV and WWF does have local staff. And now with COVID, as you all know, we're not able to travel, and all of a sudden this partnership becomes incredibly valuable because you can keep on engaging with these projects locally, and you can really use that local network. So yeah, definitely challenges, of course, but I think more advantages.
Thanks.
Shall I continue, or are there any other questions?
No, let's continue for now. Yeah.
So here you can see really an initial overview of the projects that we already contracted, and it's really, if you look at it, I'm right now quite perplexed myself, because we launched this fund less than two years ago, and you see here the wide variety of projects that we are working on, and it really ranges from small-scale solar-powered water filtration systems in Kenya that really benefit poor communities, to shrimp farming in Bangladesh, or really a large-scale seaweed aquaculture off the coast in Namibia. And I think it's really incredible to see the wide diversity of projects that can relate to climate mitigation and both adaptation. And to think that this is really the beginning of our pipeline, our portfolio development. So to go into a few cases in Komasa, the DFCD land use in Kenya, the DFCD land use facility invested in Komasa. And Komasa is quite unique, a small-scale outgrower forestry system in which poor farmers in degraded areas are able to grow their own plantations on degraded land that are currently not being used for farming, and this provides an additional kind of long-term income for them. Additionally, what I mentioned off the coast of Namibia, we are working with Kelp Blue through the water facility on really putting in place an industrial kelp farming facility that can really help with the creation of really industrial inputs such as fertilizers or textiles or even energy. And then in Bangladesh, I mentioned the shrimp farming project. You see that there are a lot of regions in Bangladesh where rice production productivity is declining because of increased salination. And so in this area, we're trying to see if we can help farmers change and improve upon their shrimp farming practices. And the beauty of this project is that we are doing this together with a shrimp farm that right now has a lot of additional capacity that can be used. So through that, you can really, with just simple support and finance, really use underused capacity. And I think this also showcases how investing in climate adaptation can make a lot of economic sense. Now, wrapping up, shortly a little bit of selfless promotion for some other events that we have. So with the DFCD, we have very specific targets also to invest in LDCs and NL priority countries, which are largely in the Sahel. And because of that, we are specifically organizing events that are focused on Kenya, Bangladesh, and Uganda to really source more projects that we can support with the origination facility. And these are 3 projects you should look on our LinkedIn or on our websites, where we have events where we organize a challenge to really find more projects. That's the winning project will eventually be presented at the COP26 in Glasgow. So if you know any climate relevant projects in these countries, really let them know about these events and ensure that you bring us in contact with them. So over to you, Marieke.
Yeah, thanks. And questions the list of questions is increasing by the minute, so that's amazing. First question is more broad, so I think it's a good one to start with, which is from Andrea. Do you aim to diversify the portfolio across impact themes? Do you have any targets on that? And are you experiencing any of the themes as more difficult to find viable deals? So Aart,
Rik, you want to answer that?
Yes, sure. Thank you for that question, Andrea and Marieke. Yes, indeed, we just go a little bit more into details, but what Rik already said, and I think also in between the rules, adaptation is important. So meaning that we do have at least a very hard criteria is that at least 50% of our investments need to be adaptation projects, but preferably 65%. Now, secondly, it's important to realize that we're really targeting the poorest countries as well. So we have, although we need, all the countries need to be not high income countries, it needs to be a maximum of middle income according to the World Bank list. But our ambition is that we also really target the poorest of the poorest countries, so the so-called least development countries. This target needs to be at least 25% of our total portfolio. And then, of course, we have the distinction between land and water, and that's more on the money flows. FMO is doing all the land projects, and we have 55 million out of the fund available for these long-term investment side. And Climate Fund managers even 75% available for water projects. And they have a little bit more money because you need to have an extra push sometimes on water projects like marine protection areas or the construction phase of water treatment plants. So these are maybe the main two criteria to use. We do not have really within the land and water specific criteria on which sub-segment. We specifically chose not to do so in our tender towards the government, because actually it's already important enough that we target the poorest countries and also target adaptation where possible, and find really the sweet spots to really also protect the communities, and find, for instance, also a good way to have as many as possible beneficiaries, because we have a couple of criteria of the fund, and one of them is the number of beneficiaries we reach, and we make a distinction between gender there as well. We really try to look which project serves the best way, the most largest number of beneficiaries, given the adaptation aspects we try to achieve. On the fact which one is the most difficult, I think we have to deal with the COVID scenario currently, and what we see is our ambition is to reach really the poorest of the poorest countries, and that's extremely difficult in the current environment. We cannot travel ourselves, which should be the case, but also within these countries, it's very restricted to travel. So we really struggle of really getting sufficient projects in the poorest of the poorest countries. But anyway, we need to do so, and we want to do so. But that's maybe the most, at this moment, the most challenging part of it. We are quite well on track on the adaptation space, but on the poorest country space, it's really challenging in the environment. But we will reach it, that's for sure.
Great, and I think more broadly speaking, I think it would be interesting to hear the methodology for you to select and monitor the projects. And I think that relates to the question that Christina also asked in the chat box, which is, how far into systems impact do you evaluate before investing in a technology? And she also put forward an example, which I will read, but you can also see it in the chat box. In the 2000s, the development world pushed the benefits of palm oil. And today we have the problem of deforestation to push palm oil plantations. I could imagine that implementing huge kelp farms will also have an impact on ecosystems eventually. Wondering thus how future impacts are evaluated. So Aart or Rik?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. I think first of all, on selecting and measuring projects, I mean, it all really starts with the theory of change, of course, and that was already created for the bidding application. And so our theory of change is that we have this origination facility that will really help us with on the ground work partnerships with NGOs to really select and groom the most impactful projects. And we do that by investing in certain sectors. And then based upon that theory of change, there are a set of targets that we have. For example, targeting beneficiaries that benefit from climate adaptation, or managing forests or agricultural landscapes sustainably. And from those targets, we have basically an impact guide created that also provides a methodology on how to measure the progress towards these targets, and also attribute that towards the investments that we make. I do think in our selection of projects, what is really key to us is that every project that we invest in has a so-called Rio Marker 2 for climate adaptation or climate mitigation. And that means that the primary objective really is to be climate relevant and promote the climate in one way or another. And so we have a lot of different discussions within the consortium, and also with dedicated ESG specialists on whether projects benefits to this. Very important to us with that is also that in some way or another, vulnerable groups are benefiting. Specific on your question on the benefits of palm oil, I think this is a very difficult and challenging topic for DFIs in general, as indeed palm oil is associated with a lot of deforestation, you can completely move out of the sector and not do anything with it, or you can see whether you can work with, for example, forestry companies. We are not working right now with any palm oil companies, but to see whether a plantation can be built around, for example, a high conservation value area, so like a natural forest, so that you can really use companies in a way to protect these vulnerable ecosystems. And I think that is really key. I see, could you imagine?
Yeah, and I was also thinking, because I do agree. Would you indeed also, if you invest in a project, would you also view the risks of, you know, if this is becoming a large scale project, could that have a negative impact on ecosystems, such as the kelp farms that Christina put forward as an example? Is that a risk analysis that you also perform pre-deal?
Yeah. So maybe Aart can say more about this, but for every large-scale project, there needs to be a so-called ACA, like an environmental and social impact assessment. Yeah, and that's part of the project development planning.
Yeah, and maybe in addition to that, FMO has a large experience on looking at environmental social aspects as a bank, but the experience of FMO is particularly based on a project level. And the advantage of this consortium is that we have WWF on board, who really looks broader than the project itself from a landscape perspective. And that means actually that we have actually maybe the best party in the world on board to look at these kind of impact, including in every project is the intention to be scalable. So WWF is already in an early stage before there's any environmental social impact assessment done. They already looked at the scoping of the project, what are the key elements, and then regularly based on these key elements, the environmental social impact assessment and all kind of other assessments are done. So I think if this consortium with WWF on board and a development bank can't do it properly, then it should not be done at all. And that's always a question we ask ourselves, shouldn't it be done at all, of course, but we think that there's a very good case also for this kelp project that it should be done at all, because it has huge benefits, including benefits for the biodiversity in the ocean itself.
Great. And Rik, could you perhaps explain what is your favorite project that you've worked on until now?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because I'm enthusiastic about a different project all the time. But I really think that yeah, for example, the project in Bangladesh that I mentioned, working with local shrimp farmers, where the project makes both economic sense, but also it has just a lot of impact, and you can really create on the ground ownership, and really can improve the lives of smallholders, but at the same time figuring out a way to make a financial return with that. I think that's really beautiful. As I think if you have that aligned, then it seems that yeah, a project is well thought out. Maybe Aart has some ideas about his favorite projects as well.
Yeah, also on the mitigation side, for instance, I was involved in large scale wind projects in Mongolia, also Kenya, beautiful project. But I think maybe one of the favorites currently we are working on is a bamboo project in Indonesia together with WWF, and it ticks so many boxes because WWF has experience to look if it is indeed good for the environment. And this bamboo will be planted with smallholders, poor farmers on degraded land, and then it has an extremely high efficiency with 1 meter in 24 hours, or even 1.5 meter in 30 hours. But it also absorbs water. It can even absorb water to around a cube of water around the roots within the bottom. So WWF is extremely excited about this project, and we are also, because it serves the communities. It has a business solution, and it has an off-taker, a large company, a company like IKEA would potentially take it off. And that's very important, because you need to have one party on board that has the ability to make it scalable. And of course, it's then for us to really look at whether the poor farmers benefit from it sufficiently, because IKEA needs to earn money anyway as a big company. And WWF will dig into depth if the environmental aspects indeed are so positive as they deem to be. But I think a fantastic project, to be honest.
Great. I think this is a good bridge to the following question from Ragav. What are the challenges with getting private investors on board? So I think this first customer, the launching customer is of course a very important one. And is there usually a convincing business case for them for such water/agriculture projects?
Maybe shall I start, Rik? Yeah, we are sometimes both enthusiastic, but I think for the private sector, it's important what we offer them, and because thanks to the funding of the Dutch government, we have grant funding available for the development phase, what Rik explained, but also the long-term finance we provide as a development bank from this fund has also a so-called grant, a concessional element, meaning that the interest rate is lower than the risk should actually normally needs to absorb. So we are providing at favorable terms finance, we're providing grants to get a project done. Well, if you have all these benefits, then we have a kind of layer of grant funding and risk taking by ourselves, then it makes the business case for a commercial portal also very attractive. So we take the main risk and then they can take the acceptable commercial risk themselves as well. And that's what we try to achieve with this fund. So it does work. It's a relatively new territory, climate adaptation for a lot of companies, but given the appetite in the market, it really is working already.
Great. So I have some quite specific questions, but I think that perhaps it would be nice to dive into detail a little bit. I do know that we have 6 minutes left, but I would propose that we just continue if there are still questions left. But of course, if you are unavailable for this session, you can just move yourself from the session. But personally, I think if there are still questions, we can continue. So a question from David: are there synergies with the Great Green Wall Initiative? And is regenerative farming that sequesters carbon in the soil a project option?
So on the Great Green Wall Initiative, yes, I think definitely there are synergies. We try to really find projects that really relate to this initiative in kind of the same countries. I think the Great Green Wall Initiative has recently become, I think, quite of a big, I would almost say, donor darling for a lot of European development institutions. So it seems that there is a lot of funding for it available. I think in many ways, the system that we have, that we have local on-the-ground presence in these countries and are really supporting projects at an early stage, can also help really meet these very ambitious targets to really green and adapt the Sahel region. And then about the question for carbon sequestration in the ground, I think that is very much something we look at. I understand that the methodologies for agriculture there are still really very much in development on how you need to measure that. But projects that we look at are, for example, also related to that, restoring peatlands to really reduce the emission right now of carbon and sequester carbon there, or also really promotes biodynamic inputs and use less chemicals in various projects actually, so that soils can really recover and sequester more carbon and just become more alive again.
So personally, I was not involved, or I'm not up to date about the Great Green Wall Initiative. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about that, or David, perhaps you could?
Yeah, so from my, I need to say I watched some videos on it and I read some elements on it online, but the idea is really to at the bottom of the Sahara kind of right now build a green wall, which is maybe not a literal green wall, but to stop desertification right now. That's right now happening. So you can imagine that the climate change in that region is really quite severe. It's really resulting in a lot of social conflicts as well. As you know, how things developed in Mali, for example. And the idea is really to turn that around and attract investments to the region that promote climate adaptation, and through that also, yeah, help communities become more resilient and prosperous.
Great. I have another bit of a specific question that I like from Sylvia. In the case of ACI AgroLink, is there any program to educate small farmers about sustainable fishing?
Yeah, maybe I can answer that.
Yeah, Aart, go ahead.
Again, a fantastic question. Again, yes, there is. That's the answer for that. And in the case of ACI AgroLink, so we are going to try to work together with a company there to finance the shrimp business. And what it actually entails is that first, there will be a complete training education program for the smallholders to learn them, maybe digging even the right ponds for the shrimp, getting the right input, but also train them to do it sustainably. Because in Bangladesh, in particular, there's of course it's a very vulnerable area in the delta that we talk about. There are a lot of areas that needs to be protected, mangroves, and often these poor farmers. They tend maybe to have a negative impact on these mangrove areas. And the key feature of this project is to make it sustainably. So learn them to do it in a proper way without harming the environment, using the right inputs, but also giving them an even better income than they have now by not selling it to intermediate segment that has a lot of profit, but selling it directly to the company and increasing their profit substantially as well, next to not harming the environment.
Yeah, maybe to add to that as well, I think the project also eventually wants to pursue an FSC certification. And if you can help smallholder farmers also with becoming certified using a sustainability standard like that, you can really also increase their incomes quite substantially. Yeah. So I think that's quite beautiful as well, that yeah, explaining and teaching them sustainable fishing practices can eventually, if you succeed in getting such a certification, also yeah, really increase incomes.
Thank you. A question from Camilla. How do you balance adaptation and mitigation projects? Is there any percentage you try to maintain?
Yeah, on the portfolio level, we have this at least 50, but preferably 65% being adaptation projects. As also Rik said, there needs to be either the key purpose of the project needs to be either mitigation or adaptation. So not, and then these are the main constraints. But we always look at both elements, both at a mitigation as an adaptation element. And most projects we see now that they have a key element on adaptation or mitigation, but there's still also an element on mitigation and adaptation as a second goal. So most projects we envisage now have both elements on board actually. But in principle, we could also do a 100% adaptation element without clearly a mitigation element. But then of course we look that it doesn't harm the environment. But we could have a very good adaptation project that doesn't have an impact on reducing greenhouse gases, for instance, but does have impact on sustainably agriculture on depleted land that will be restored, for instance.
Yeah.
Is that answering your question? Because it's a really it's a difficult one, but a very key one.
Camilla, does it answer your question? Yeah, great. Also something that I read, I think last week, that there is of course no planet B. It's something that we read a lot. but we do have a plan B, which is then adaptation. So I do like that link. So I have some more questions. So I'll just continue, but again, the session officially was only 45 minutes, so feel free to leave the session if your time is up. But we'll just continue because it's, I think, very interesting. Noting, yeah?
Oh, may I add one thing on what you mentioned, because I like what you said about the plan B and adaptation. I think the crucial thing, because I have done a lot of things in the mitigation space and renewable energy projects, but really the nicest part of climate adaptation is how we work on it, is that it has an automatic link towards reaching the most vulnerable in the world. You can have a very nice solar plant in Africa country or a wind project in a country in Latin America or Asia, without actually benefiting at all the poorest one, because all the electricity goes to the people with high incomes. Adaptation, per definition, in development countries is always linked to the most vulnerables in society, and that's also make it very important to have a plan B. And I forgot to say that, so just would like to highlight that, Marika.
Yeah, amazing. So I have a question from Andrea, I believe, which is the following. It's a long sentence, so bear with me. Noting that J-curve for the Valley of Death and considering how long it takes for organic material to decompose, I guess it takes quite some time and money to rejuvenate a degraded landscape or to get stripped soil back to a nutrient-rich state. Are you seeing that in practice? So it's kind of a hypothesis with a question whether that indeed is something that you see in practice.
Rik, can you help us out there? I need to think about it. It's a very good question, but maybe you already are quicker than I am, Rik.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different levels of degradation. I think there are different crops that you can, or different things that you can produce to kind of re-fertilize the ground and bring nutrients back. So my assumption here is that this is very context specific. What is the local situation to do so? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also, it takes time, because Rik showed the map with all the projects we have done, and I think it takes time to see how it further improves substantially in the coming years. So at the same time, because we have such an expertise on board with WWF, etc., and the parties we work with, I think also improving this degraded land will surely be also monitored properly, and we will see the benefits later on. That's for sure.
Great. So I have a specific question on CO2 capturing. Gurkan, I'm not sure if I pronounced your name correctly, but he sends an interesting question. Hi, most of the CO2 capturing projects are still not feasible in terms of economics. Is there any kind of projects in your portfolio, or do you have to, or how do you evaluate CO2 capturing projects? So it's about the profitability of CO2 capturing projects, I guess.
Yeah, if you look at what we do, CO2 sequestration, capturing, forestry is then the main element in our portfolio. Within the land space, we do in particular agriculture and forestry. Forestry is a lot about capturing CO2. And at the same time, I think I fully agree with this question that it's difficult and it takes time. What we consider our capital, apart from the development of the grants, we consider capital as being patient capital, meaning that if we do a forestry project, it takes time to capture all the carbon and to make it sustainably. And we need to, then we can structure a kind of long-term debt that doesn't have to be repaid at all in the first years. And only after it really becomes mature, after carbon has been captured, and after there's a certain revenue stream as such a kind of forced carbon project, then the money needs to be repaid. So our financial solution there is just having patience and structuring the facility around that.
Maybe to...
And David also provided some insights through the chat box. Could you maybe explain what you mean by the ex-ante financing?
Sorry, I was just replying to a comment that was put in above. I just wanted to say that, yeah, it is possible that you can get funding beforehand for a project. If you have solid data, if you're using a solid model like the YASO model used in Finland. But in that situation, you're talking about a fund that deals with carbon credits, and they will be taking on the risk on your behalf.
Clear.
Yep.
Thank you. Rik?
Yeah, and I do think we've seen quite a few, I think, carbon sequestration projects that look very profitable. That's quite a good track record. I think what I think is very interesting about the market is that it's all kind of like over the counter, at least in developing countries, contracts in a way. So there is not really a very clear market. Every carbon credit, or at least in the voluntary carbon market, is unique. But really depends also on the company that sells it and how, I think, likable the project is, what the profits seem to be. I think it's challenging for us as a development finance institution is that the prices have been quite volatile, it seems. It's quite a new market. We don't know where it's going to be. And really giving long-term financing based upon carbon revenues by itself only is, it seems to be perhaps be quite risky if you invest a large amount. But really ideal projects for us, therefore, if you can combine a carbon credit element with something else, or find really a method to diversify the risk a little bit. But we're very eager to see whether we can do some carbon projects, and we are already supporting some carbon projects with grants from the origination facility.
Yeah. So I think that we are coming to the end of our session. I think I want to ask two more questions, if that is okay with you, Rik and Aart. First question is from Andre. Do you actively engage with the investees to align better with your targets? If so, could you quickly elaborate on the approach?
Yeah, maybe to shortly answer that, I think our investments are relatively new. We do obviously engage with them quite actively, but I think a lot of work is of course also done before you make the investment to really align everything. And ideally, you don't engage with them too much, but whenever that's needed, you do that. But I think with the DFCD, we have quite a strong selection at the start already, whether impact is really properly reflected in these projects. And you see that overall, I think the clients that we work with are very enthusiastic and passionate about impact and climate as well. You want to add anything to that, Aart?
Yeah, maybe in addition, we have reporting requirements with them, and we discussed them then as well. So the number of beneficiaries we mentioned, the number of sustainably managed hectares, and the number of CO2 sequestered or avoided. And because we have these indicators, this also gives us the right way of discussing it with them, how the progress is evolving.
Yeah, so there's a clear communication between you and the investees, and they know what they're getting themselves into, and they know what is expected from them.
Yeah, for sure. And far more than normally as a development bank, because we have this origination partners on the ground who help develop it together with the client. Yeah. Okay. So I have one final question. It's a follow-up question from one that we had before, from Ragas. He says, thank you for answering my earlier question. If I heard correctly, you mentioned paying good interest rate to private investors and taking on a lot of project risk. Can you give an example of how a project generated strong financial value, which facilitated your ability to pay a good interest back? I think it was related to an answer from me. So it's let's assume that you have an, for instance, this ACE AgroLink project we briefly touched upon in Bangladesh, sustainable shrimp farming. You can imagine that for a company, a Bangladesh company, there they need to make a profit, so it will be difficult for them to invest too much money into training the smallholder farmers, into looking at the supply chain, into helping them with building the right ponds, etc. So we first provided the grant element already, but at second stage, if we really wanted to scale up in order to do something really special in this delta area, in order to protect the mangroves, we help them with a loan facility that has a higher interest rate than any other bank, lower interest rate than any other bank would request. So because they pay less interest, actually the profit goes up for them, and that makes them also possible to scale up. Otherwise, maybe it might have been too risky for them. But because they pay this lower interest rate, they have a far more easy incentive to scale up and to also earn a fair profit on their business.
All right. I think that's clear. Yeah, thank you. And I think we are going to finalize the session. Rik, Aart, do you have any more to add, or is it okay if I wrap it up?
No, just hopefully this session has also, and I really want to thank everybody, because really we've got a fantastic, great questions that were really on the heart of what we are doing. So thanks everybody for joining. But also I would like to highlight that hopefully everybody also has a kind of feeling that we can do something on this extremely big climate crisis we are all facing, and with two plans on the mitigation side, but definitely also on the adaptation side, in order to help the most vulnerable in the world. Yeah,
so that's great. I think the positive view is definitely a good one to take, and also the discussion has been very interesting. There's a lot of thank yous on the Q&A, so I think everyone enjoyed the session as much as I did. So again, Rik and Aart, thank you very much for your insights today. Thank you everyone for joining and participating this actively. I even prepared some questions, but they were not needed for today. So maybe I will ask them privately to Rik and Aart. So again, thank you very much also, Andrea, for organizing, and hopefully see you in the next session.
Thank you, Marieke. Thanks, everyone. It was really, really great.
Yes, thanks, everyone. Have a nice weekend. Bye.
Yes.